The first airplane landed on my wheat field at 611 on a Sunday morning. It was a silver single-engine Cirrus carrying a real estate agent and two prospective buyers. They rolled past my barn, stopped beside a temporary fuel truck, and climbed out holding brochures for a luxury fly-in community called HOA Airpark. According to the brochure, the strip running through my farm was the western half of a private 4,800-foot runway. I owned one. 437 feet of it. I had never sold it. I had never leased it. And I had never authorized the HOA to pave, light, fence, or advertise it as an airport. The HOA president told me my father had granted permanent aviation rights to the neighboring property in 1986. What my father actually signed was a one-season license allowing a local crop dusting pilot to land on our grass field while spraying nearby farms. The license expired after 90 days. It prohibited paving. It prohibited transfer. And the pilot named in it had died 27 years earlier. By the time I discovered what the developer had done, 78 hangar homes were under contract. The first 24 buyers had paid deposits totaling more than $9 million. And a regional lender had invested $28 million in roads, utilities, hangars, and aviation infrastructure. The developer thought no judge would close an airport after homes and pilots depended on it. Then I found the runway certification package. Inside was a sworn statement saying the HOA owned every foot of the landing surface. Attached to that statement was my father's signature. It came from a document he signed 9 years before the crop dusting license existed. My name is Michael Barrett. I'm 64 years old, and I own 312 acres outside Salina, Kansas. My family has farmed there since 1954. We grow winter wheat, sorghum, soybeans, and alfalfa. The land is mostly level, which is useful for farming and irresistible to anyone looking for a place to land an airplane. I grew up around both. My father ran the farm. My uncle repaired agricultural aircraft at the county airport. I spent half my childhood inside machinery sheds and the other half beneath the wings of crop dusters. After high school, I became an aircraft mechanic. I worked 36 years maintaining single-engine airplanes, business aircraft, and agricultural planes before returning to manage the farm full-time. I understood engines, landing gear, inspection, fuel systems, runway markings, and the paperwork that makes the difference between a field where an aircraft happens to land and an airport approved for regular operations. My property includes a long rectangular field along the eastern boundary. The field measures almost a mile from north to south. It's flat enough that crop dusting pilots occasionally used it before the county built a proper agricultural strip in the 1990s. Those pilots never possessed permanent rights. They checked the crop condition. They received permission for a specific day or season. In 1986, a pilot named Russell Avery needed a temporary operating base while spraying wheat fields during a severe aphid outbreak. My father signed a written license. Russell could use a 2,600-foot grass strip for 90 days. He could place one portable fuel tank beside the equipment barn. He had to maintain liability insurance, repair crop damage, and remove everything when the season ended. The license couldn't be assigned. It created no easement. It granted no interest in the property. Russell finished the work, removed his tank, and paid my father for the damaged wheat. The field returned to farming. That was the entire history. Russell died in 1998. For almost 4 decades, nobody suggested the license created an airport. Then the neighboring ranch was sold. The Hawthorne family owned 100 acres east of mine. Their property included pasture, 2 ponds, and a narrow grass airstrip built for the owner's personal aircraft. That strip was 400 feet long. It worked for small planes under favorable conditions, but didn't support the kind of fly-in development a company called Altitude Residential Partners wanted to build. Altitude purchased the Hawthorne Ranch for $14 million. Its proposed project included 78 luxury homes. Each home would have a private aircraft hangar connected to a network of taxiways. The development would also contain a clubhouse, maintenance facility, fuel station, pilote lounge, swimming pool, and direct access to an upgraded runway. The least expensive hangar homes started at $1 million. Several exceeded $2 5 million. Altitude called the project Hawthorne Airpark Estates. Before selling the first lot, Altitude created the Hawthorne Airpark Property Owners Association. The developer appointed the initial board. Its vice president of aviation development, Jonathan Pierce, became HOA president. Jonathan was 52 and had previously managed 2 small private airports. He wasn't a reckless amateur. He knew airports require land control, clear approaches, maintenance funding, insurance, emergency planning, and operational rules. That made his later decisions difficult to describe as misunderstanding. Jonathan visited me a year before construction began. He arrived in a white SUV with Altitude's civil engineer and aviation consultant. They spread a runway diagram across my kitchen table. Altitude wanted to extend the existing Hawthorne Strip 437 feet west across my wheat field. The extension would create a 4,800-foot paved runway capable of serving a wider range of private aircraft. The project also required approach lighting equipment, drainage, a perimeter fence, a maintenance road, and a protected safety area beyond the pavement. Jonathan offered $350,000 for 22 acres. I declined. The runway would divide one of my best fields, disrupt irrigation, complicate equipment movement, and place aircraft less than 800 feet from my house. He increased the offer to $500. Ling ling ling. I declined again. Then he proposed a permanent aviation easement for $275. Ling ling ling. Altitude would own the pavement and maintain it. I would keep underlying ownership but couldn't farm, build, plant tall crops, or interfere with aircraft operations inside the corridor. That wasn't meaningful ownership. It was an airport occupying my land while my name remained on the tax record. I refused. Jonathan asked whether I opposed the development. No. Do you oppose aviation? I've repaired airplanes most of my life. Then what's the concern? You need my land to make your runway work. I don't want to sell it. He pointed to the old grass field on an aerial photograph. Aircraft have operated there for decades. With permission. Our title researchers found historical aviation rights. If you mean Russell Avery's license? Read the expiration date. Jonathan's expression changed slightly. He hadn't expected me to identify the document. We're reviewing all historical use. You should review the part that says 90 days. He folded the runway diagram and left. 3 months later, Altitude submitted its development plan to the county. The public map showed a 4,800-foot runway crossing the property boundary. My farm appeared as Western Aviation Protection Area. The map didn't identify me as owner. During the planning hearing, Altitude's attorney said the runway extension followed an existing aviation corridor supported by historical agreements. I submitted my deed and the complete 1,986 license. The county attorney explained that zoning approval wouldn't decide private property rights. Altitude could receive land use approval, but couldn't build on property it didn't control. Jonathan said the company expected to resolve all access questions before construction. The project received conditional approval. One condition required proof of runway site control before final airport operations. That should have protected me. It didn't stop Altitude from designing around my land. Construction began on the Hawthorne Ranch the following spring. Roads and taxiways appeared first. Utility crews installed water, sewer, power, and fiber. Hangar home foundations followed. Altitude widened and graded the original 3,400-foot strip on its own property. I installed cameras along my eastern boundary and placed fresh survey markers near the old crop dusting field. For 6 months, contractors stayed on their side. Then survey stakes appeared inside mine. I called Jonathan. He said the crew was verifying approach elevations. I reminded him no access agreement existed. He apologized and said the surveyors would be removed. They left that afternoon. 2 weeks later, a soil drilling rig entered from the Hawthorne property at night. My camera recorded it, taking samples near the proposed runway centerline. I drove out and stopped the operator before the third boring. The contractor showed me an altitude work order describing the site as developer-controlled airport property. I photographed the document and told the crew to leave. Jonathan called the next morning. He claimed Altitude's legal department believed the crop dusting license, historical use, and visible landing strip created a continuing aviation easement. That field grew soybeans last year. I told him, the corridor remains physically identifiable. So does an old wagon trail. That doesn't make it an interstate. He said the lawyers would handle it. I hired a property attorney named Sarah Mitchell. Sarah had represented farms, pipeline operators, utilities, and local airports in easement disputes. She reviewed the deeds, aerial records, 1,986 license, county plans, and Altitude's correspondence. Her conclusion was simple. No aviation easement existed. The crop dusting permission was temporary, personnel to Russell, and explicitly non-transferable. Even if someone could prove occasional landings afterward, those landings occurred with permission or without the continuous adverse use required for a prescriptive claim. Altitude had owned the neighboring property for less than a year. Sarah sent a formal notice to Altitude, the HOA, its airport consultant, civil contractor, liner, and insurers. The notice prohibited surveying, grading, paving, flying, lighting, fencing, fuel storage, or construction on my property without written permission. It also warned that the field remained active agricultural land. Altitude acknowledged receipt. 4 months passed. Then my sister in Wichita suffered a stroke. I left the farm for 9 days. When I returned, a temporary construction fence blocked my eastern farm road. Beyond it, the graders had removed wheat from a strip 220 feet wide. A crushed stone runway base extended more than half a mile onto my property. Drainage pipes crossed the field. Workers had installed underground conduit for runway lights. The irrigation main, serving 80 acres, had been cut and capped. Altitude had entered from the east and constructed so quickly that nothing was visible from the county road until the work reached the center of my farm. I called Sarah first, then the sheriff. Jonathan arrived with Altitude's attorney and a thick binder. He claimed the HOA was exercising historical aviation rights. The binder contained the expired license, aerial photographs, pilot statements, and a modern survey labeling the corridor as an existing runway. The sheriff's deputies documented the work but wouldn't rule on the easement. They warned both sides to avoid physical confrontation. I asked Jonathan why he waited until I left town. He said the schedule had nothing to do with my travel. My cameras recorded your crews checking the house every morning. That was standard site security observation. You cut my irrigation line. We'll relocate it. You removed 22 acres of wheat. We'll compensate you. You paved runway base across land you don't own. Jonathan looked toward the graders. The aviation corridor existed before either of us entered this dispute. No. Russell had permission for 90 days. You're relying on wording written before modern airport development. I'm relying on the only document you have. He lowered his voice. Once 78 families have aircraft based here. No court will close the runway and trap millions of dollars in hangars because a farmer wants to keep planting through an established landing path. That was his arrogant line. He didn't expect to prove the easement cleanly. He expected the completed community to create pressure stronger than the expiration clause. I gave Altitude one opportunity. Stop work. Restore the irrigation line. Remove construction material. Compensate me for the crop. If Altitude needed temporary runway access while redesigning, I would consider an 18-month license. The license would cost $20,000 per month. Aircraft operations would be limited by time, weight, noise, and weather. Altitude would fund a $2 million restoration bond and build its permanent extension elsewhere before expiration. The company could shorten its runway, purchase land north of the development, or redesign the Western taxiway system. Jonathan rejected it. He said no lender would finance an airport dependent on a temporary license. That was true. It was also why Altitude needed to purchase permanent rights before selling fly-in homes. The company resumed work within 3 weeks. Contractors completed the stone base and laid the first layer of asphalt. Runway lights appeared along both edges. A white center line extended across my wheat field. Altitude filed suit asking the court to confirm an aviation easement by express grant. Application. Prescription. Estoppel. And necessity. 5 theories. The necessity claim was weak. Hawthorne Airpark wasn't landlocked. Its original 3.400 foot runway remained usable for smaller aircraft. Altitude could extend east or acquire different land at greater expense. Convenience and profitability don't create legal necessity. Sarah filed counterclaims for trespass. Crop destruction. Irrigation damage. Unauthorized construction. And removal of soil. She requested an immediate injunction. The hearing occurred 7 business days later. Altitude argued that stopping construction would cost $180. 0.000 per day. Jeopardize aircraft safety work. And threaten 78 home contracts. Sarah presented the complete license. Tax records showing continuous farming. Aerial photographs. My certified notice. The survey pins. And Altitude's purchase offers. The judge asked why Altitude offered me $500,000 if it believed the runway corridor already belonged to the HOA. The attorney said the offer was intended to clarify rights and avoid delay. The judge called that explanation possible but unpersuasive. He prohibited further work on my property. No paving, no lighting, no fencing, no aircraft operations, no maintenance, no marketing representing the disputed section as available runway. Altitude could preserve exposed construction material to prevent erosion, but couldn't finish the extension. The company had 10 days to restore my irrigation line. The injunction stopped the graders. It didn't stop the sales office. Altitude sent buyers a letter describing the issue as a temporary dispute over the Western Runway Protection Zone. It said the company expected full operations before the first residents moved in. The 78 hangar homes remained for sale. I requested every public aviation and development record connected to Hawthorne Airpark. The state airport office had received an application to register a 4.800-foot private use airport. The application required the operator to identify the runway owner, controlling entity, emergency contacts, operating limitations, and proof of legal site access. Altitude listed Hawthorne Airpark HOA as the runway owner. The legal description included my 22 acres. Attached was an aviation site control declaration. The declaration stated that the HOA possessed permanent, assignable rights across the full runway, safety areas, lighting zones, and approaches. Jonathan signed for the HOA. Behind the declaration was a document titled Barrett Aviation Agreement. I had never seen it. The first page used language similar to Russell's crop dusting license. The second page granted a permanent aviation easement benefiting the Hawthorne property. The signature at the bottom looked like my father's. My father had been dead for 11 years. When the document's printed date said he signed it, Sarah ordered a forensic examination. The signature matched one found on a $1,977 farm equipment loan recorded at the county clerk's office. Someone had copied it. The false agreement wasn't recorded in the land records. It appeared only in the airport certification package. Altitude claimed it received the document from an aviation title consultant named Prairie Flight Holdings. Prairie Flight had been formed 6 months before the application. Its registered office belonged to Jonathan's college roommate. Altitude had paid the company $85,000 for historical runway rights consolidation. The arrangement looked bad. It didn't yet prove who created the document. Sarah notified the state airport office through a sworn statement. The office suspended Hawthorne's registration review. It instructed Altitude that no routine aircraft operations could use the disputed runway during the investigation. The project's aviation insurer reserved coverage. The lender suspended runway funding. Then the first unauthorized aircraft landed. It happened at 6:11 on a Sunday morning. The asphalt base wasn't finished, but enough surface existed for a small aircraft under ideal conditions. A silver Cirrus approached from the east, touched down on Altitude's original runway, and rolled more than 900 feet onto my property. The pilot was carrying a real estate agent and two prospective buyers. Altitude had arranged a private sales demonstration. Temporary cones marked the runway edge. A fuel truck waited beside my barn. The pilot believed the runway was open. The buyers believed the HOA owned it. I called the sheriff and state airport office. Nobody was injured. The plane departed from Altitude's side. After investigators documented the landing, the state issued an immediate operational closure for the entire runway until Altitude established safe, usable length, markings, barriers, and legal control. The original 3,400-foot section could potentially reopen later. For the moment, no aircraft could land. The lender expanded its review. 24 buyers had paid deposits totaling more than $9 million. Many owned aircraft requiring more runway than the original grass strip provided under summer conditions. Their purchase decisions depended on the paved 4,800-foot runway. One buyer named Thomas Reed contacted me. Thomas was a 59-year-old orthopedic surgeon from Dallas who owned a twin-engine aircraft. He had placed a $420,000 deposit on a $2 $1 million hangar home. Altitude sales representative told him the runway was fully controlled by the HOA and scheduled to open within months. He asked me whether I wanted the airpark shut down. No. Would you sell the land? No. Would you allow temporary use? I already offered 18 months while they built another solution. Thomas asked how much. I told him $20,000 per month, plus a restoration bond and operating restrictions. He became quiet. That's less than 1% of what they've spent on the development. They didn't reject it because of price. They rejected it because temporary access doesn't support permanent home values. Thomas organized a buyer committee. Within 2 weeks, 37 purchasers demanded the runway documents, airport application, insurer correspondence, lender notices, alternate extension studies, and copies of every historical access agreement. Altitude resisted. The buyer's attorneys threatened coordinated cancellation claims. The company produced part of the file. The permanent Barrett aviation agreement was included without explanation. Thomas compared the date with my father's obituary. The document claimed my father signed it 11 years after his death. Altitude's public explanation collapsed. Jonathan was removed as HOA president and placed on administrative leave. The company appointed its compliance director, Elaine Morris, to manage the association. Elaine's first notice to buyers admitted that permanent Western runway rights hadn't been verified. It also disclosed that the state had suspended airport registration. 14 buyers demanded immediate deposit refunds. Altitude returned 6. The others entered mediation. The company still insisted the project could be saved. It had 3 physical options. Use the existing 3,400-foot runway and limit aircraft types. Extend east through a shallow drainage basin on land, Altitude owned, or purchase one 900 feet from another farmer north of the development and rotate the runway alignment. The eastern extension was cheapest. It required relocating a county drainage channel, constructing an elevated pavement section, and removing 6 premium lots. Estimated cost $5 million. The northern realignment cost between $9 million and $12 million, reducing the runway to 3,400 feet cost the least, but destroyed the project's marketing promise to many buyers. Altitude returned to me with its largest offer, $8 million for 22 acres. I refused. $2 million. I refused again. Jonathan attended the negotiation despite being on leave. He said the amount exceeded the agricultural value by more than 20 times. That doesn't require me to sell. Your field is worth maybe $90,000 as cropland. To you, it completes a $28 million airpark. We're offering more than fair value. You're offering less than the cost of your next legal option. Jonathan's attorney asked whether any number would work. I said no. The land wasn't available for a permanent airport. They had the answer before the first grader crossed the boundary. Altitude left without agreement. 3 days later, Sarah received the airport lender's original underwriting file. The file contained an engineering study comparing the 3 runway options. It was dated 8 months before Altitude purchased the Hawthorne Ranch. The study stated clearly that the western extension crossed Barrett-owned farmland and required acquisition before development. It recommended budgeting $2.5 million for land and negotiation risk. Jonathan had initialed the report. Altitude removed the acquisition budget from the final development model and replaced it with a $150 Sifferline labelet, historical aviation rights confirmation. The company hadn't discovered my ownership after construction began. It knew the runway depended on purchasing my land before buying the ranch. It simply decided historical rights paperwork would be cheaper. The underwriting file contained another report. This one analyzed runway approaches and underground conditions. The eastern extension crossed an area labeled Dry Creek Basin. The basin appeared dry most of the year. During extreme storms, it carried water across the Hawthorne property toward a county flood control channel. Altitude's engineers warned that extending the runway east would require bridges or large culverts to preserve flood capacity. That explained why the company preferred my field. My land was flat, dry, and inexpensive if they could take it without buying it. Then the county archive produced a 1,964 aerial photograph. The photograph showed something none of the modern runway maps included. A former military fuel line crossed beneath the original Hawthorne airstrip and continued toward my eastern boundary. The line had served an auxiliary training field during the 1950s. It was listed as abandoned. No one knew whether it had been completely removed. The state airport inspector ordered a subsurface utility survey before reopening even the original 3,400-foot runway. Ground-penetrating radar found the old line. It also found 3 underground tanks near the planned Hawthorne fuel station. One tank contained liquid. Field testing detected aviation gasoline compounds. The tanks weren't on my property. They belonged to the former Hawthorne Ranch. Altitude had built its fuel station and main taxiway above an undocumented historic storage area. The western easement dispute had exposed a second problem inside land. The company actually owned. The state environmental agency required investigation before the runway could reopen. Soil borings found contamination around 2 tanks. The groundwater direction pointed southeast. Away from my farm but toward Dry Creek Basin, no occupied wells were immediately threatened. Cleanup was possible. It would take months. The $28 million Airpark now faced 3 separate obstacles: no legal western runway, no active airport registration, and a contaminated fuel site beneath the center of its own aviation facilities. But the oldest tank contained more than fuel residue. Investigators recovered a sealed metal document tube from a dry compartment attached to its access vault. Inside were maintenance diagrams, military property maps, and a deed recorded in 1956. The deed reserved a 75-foot wide federal aviation corridor across the Hawthorne Ranch. That corridor didn't cross my land. It ran northeast, toward an abandoned auxiliary landing field 2 miles away. The easement had never been formally released. If still valid, it offered Altitude a possible legal route for the northern runway realignment. But it also gave the federal government continuing rights through 11 planned cabin lots, the clubhouse parking area, and part of the hangar taxiway. Altitude had spent months inventing historical rights over my farm. Now a genuine historical aviation right had surfaced inside its own development, and unlike Russell Avery's 90-day license, this one had no expiration date. The Federal Aviation Corridor didn't give Altitude permission to build another runway. Not automatically. The 1,956 deed reserved rights for the federal government to access, operate, maintain, and protect an auxiliary military landing route. Altitude wasn't the federal government. The HOA wasn't a lawful successor to a military agency. A government easement can remain recorded long after its original purpose disappears. But a private developer can't simply adopt it because the route becomes convenient. Altitude needed the responsible federal property office to determine whether the corridor remained necessary. If the agency released it, the land would return to the Hawthorne title free of the old burden. If it retained the easement, Altitude might have to redesign roads, lots, taxiways, and the clubhouse area around federal rights it hadn't disclosed to buyers. Either outcome took time. The lender extended the airport default period by 60 days, while the agency reviewed the records. Altitude had to protect unfinished homes. Investigate the fuel contamination. Resolve buyer claims. And produce a workable runway plan before that deadline expired. The company hired an environmental contractor to remove the 3 underground tanks. The largest held approximately 1,800 gallons of degraded aviation fuel mixed with water. The second contained sludge. The third was empty, but had leaked through corrosion holes near its bottom. Crews excavated contaminated soil across almost 2 acres. The main taxiway and unfinished fuel station were removed to reach it. Testing found petroleum compounds in shallow groundwater. But contamination hadn't reached neighboring wells or my property. The plume remained inside the former Hawthorne Ranch and moved slowly toward Dry Creek Basin. Regulators approved a cleanup plan involving soil removal, groundwater recovery, monitoring wells, and treatment of water collected near the basin. Estimated cost $1.6 million. Altitude's environmental insurer covered part of it. The policy excluded known conditions and inadequate pre-purchase investigation. The company hadn't known about the tanks. It had ignored a historical use that should have prompted additional investigation. That distinction reduced, but didn't eliminate, insurance coverage. The cleanup didn't make the airpark impossible. It did remove another section of taxiway from service and delay the fuel facility by at least 9 months. Altitude could build homes while the cleanup continued. It couldn't represent the aviation infrastructure as complete. Buyers received a revised disclosure package. The package admitted 4 unresolved issues. The western runway extension crossed land. Altitude didn't control. The state had suspended airport registration. The former military fuel site required environmental cleanup, and the federal aviation corridor remained under review. 31 buyers requested release from their contracts. Altitude negotiated rather than forcing every dispute into court. 17 buyers received full deposit returns. 9 accepted revised closing dates, price reductions, or escrow protections. 5 remained in mediation. Thomas Reed stayed under contract but joined the buyer committee's leadership. He told Altitude he would close only if his aircraft could legally and safely use the final runway. A marketing promise wasn't enough anymore. He wanted registration, insurance, pavement certification, fuel approval, and recorded site control. Those were ordinary requirements for an airport. They sounded revolutionary only because Altitude had tried to sell homes before securing them. Our property case moved toward partial summary judgment. Altitude's attorneys quietly abandoned the supposed permanent Barrett aviation agreement after the forensic examiner concluded my father's signature had been copied from the $1,977 equipment loan. The company still claimed prescription, implication, estoppel, and necessity. Each theory weakened under discovery. Altitude couldn't prove continuous adverse use across my field. Crop dusting flights occurred under express permission. Later, occasional landings were scattered and often involved pilots my family knew. The field had been planted repeatedly, eliminating any claim of an uninterrupted visible runway. No common owner had historically divided the Hawthorne property from mine in a way that created an implied aviation easement, and Altitude had at least 3 possible alternatives. Even if each cost more, a right isn't legally necessary just because it protects a developer's profit margin. The judge issued a written ruling. Altitude, Hawthorne Airpark HOA, its buyers, contractors, pilots, guests, insurers, and lenders possessed no runway, aviation, access, safety zone, lighting, approach, maintenance, fuel, taxiway, or surface rights across my property. The 1,986 license expired after 90 days. Every construction activity beyond the boundary was unauthorized. Altitude had to remove the pavement, lights, fencing, conduit, drainage structure, and runway material from my land. Unless we reached a separate restoration agreement, the company couldn't use economic reliance created after receiving notice as a substitute for ownership. That sentence ended the easement dispute. It didn't end the project. Jonathan's strategy had depended on completing enough runway to make removal seem irrational. The judge refused to reward the strategy. Altitude offered me $2. $7 million after the ruling. I refused. $3 million. I refused again. Sarah asked whether I wanted to keep negotiating. No. Even if they reach 4, the land isn't an unfinished auction. Altitude finally accepted that the runway had to move. Its engineers concentrated on the northern realignment and eastern extension. The federal corridor review became central. The government found no continuing operational need for the 1,956 easement. The auxiliary field had closed in 1962. No agency had maintained aviation equipment there for decades, but releasing the corridor required environmental confirmation, legal review, updated surveying, and payment of administrative costs. The process would take 6 to 12 months, even after release. Altitude still needed land beyond the Hawthorne property to create a safe northern runway orientation. The company approached a neighboring landowner named Margaret Ellis. Margaret owned 146 acres north of the development. She raised cattle and leased part of the land for hay. The new runway plan required purchasing 38 acres from her and obtaining approach protection rights over another 20. Altitude offered $1. 9 million. Margaret declined. Unlike my field, the requested parcel didn't divide the center of her farm. She was willing to sell at a price reflecting the value to the airpark. Her number was $4. 8 million. Altitude called it excessive. Margaret pointed toward the western runway. Altitude had already paved and then lost. You're not buying pasture, she said. You're buying the runway that keeps you from refunding $9 million in deposits. She understood valuation. The company negotiated for 3 weeks and settled at $4. 15 million. Margaret kept a 50-foot agricultural crossing beneath a controlled taxiway bridge so cattle and equipment could move between her remaining fields. Altitude paid to build a new access lane, fencing, drainage, and a stock water connection. The agreement was recorded before construction began. That detail made it the most legally secure part of Hawthorne Airpark. The northern runway would be 650 feet long instead of 4. Babe. It could serve most aircraft used by buyers, subject to pilot judgment, weather, weight, and performance requirements. Thomas's twin-engine aircraft could operate there under ordinary conditions. Altitude reduced its advertising claims and required every buyer to confirm aircraft compatibility independently. The runway relocation cost estimate reached $11. 3 million. That included land acquisition, grading, drainage, lights, taxiways, navigation studies, environmental work, and removal of the unauthorized western extension. The company had rejected my $360 18-month license because temporary rights didn't support financing. Now it was spending more than 30 times that amount, creating permanent access it actually owned. The buyer committee demanded control over the HOA's aviation agreements before accepting the new plan. Altitude's original documents required the HOA to purchase the runway, taxiways, fuel facility, and airport operating company from developer affiliates. The scheduled price was $18. $6 million over 25 years. Homeowners would also fund maintenance, snow removal, pavement reserves, lighting, insurance, security, emergency services, and future rehabilitation. An independent airport consultant reviewed the arrangement. He estimated the final infrastructure's fair value at $13 million to $15 million after completion. The difference reflected financing and service costs, but several charges overlapped. Runway inspections appeared in both the operating contract and HOA budget. Fuel facility maintenance was charged separately, even though a developer affiliate retained fuel sale profits. Pavement reserves assumed 20 years of life, while engineering documents recommended major rehabilitation, closer to 15. The consultant also found something buyers hadn't been told. Altitude planned to sell up to 40 non-resident airport memberships. Those members would receive runway, fuel, lounge, and limited hangar access without owning homes. Their fees improved the developer's revenue model. They also increased aircraft movements, noise, maintenance, traffic, and liability for the HOA. Sales brochures described Hawthorne as an exclusive private airpark for residents and invited guests. The non-resident memberships turned it into something broader. Depending on operations and state classifications, the airport might require different approvals, emergency planning, and insurance. Thomas objected immediately. He hadn't paid $2.1 million to share the runway with 40 unrelated pilots selected by a developer affiliate. Other residents supported outside memberships if the fees reduced HOA dues. Again, reasonable interests differed. The problem was disclosure. Altitude had written the membership revenue into the financing model before selling the first house. Buyers never saw it. The committee demanded a resident vote before any non-owner aviation memberships could be issued. Altitude resisted because expected fees supported airport financing. The lender eventually sided with the homeowners. An airport dependent on disputed membership revenue carried more risk than one supported by transparent owner assessments. The revised HOA documents required 2/3 owner approval for non-resident memberships. Fuel profits would belong to the HOA after transfer. Operating, maintenance, and reserve charges were consolidated into one audited budget. The airport purchase price would be based on independent appraisal after completion, excluding the cost of legal disputes, contaminated soil cleanup, unauthorized Western construction, and correction of developer errors. That condition protected homeowners from paying for the runway Altitude built and had to remove from my farm. Jonathan remained on administrative leave while Altitude investigated the false Barrett Aviation Agreement. Prairie Flight Holdings produced its records under subpoena. The company belonged to Jonathan's former college roommate, Evan Cole. Evan had worked in aircraft sales but had no experience examining land titles. Jonathan hired him to locate historical documents supporting runway access. Evan found Russell Avery's license at the county archive. He also found my father's $1,977 equipment loan. Digital forensic analysis showed the false agreement was assembled on Evan's computer. He copied several paragraphs from the temporary license, added permanent easement language, inserted my father's signature from the loan, and created a false date. Evan claimed Jonathan instructed him to create a reconstructed memorandum showing the rights Altitude believed had existed historically. Jonathan denied requesting a false document. Emails made the distinction difficult. Jonathan wrote, "We need a clean permanent form agreement suitable for the state site control package. Use available Barrett signatures and historical aviation language. Do not include temporary limitations that were specific to Avery's spraying contract." Evan replied, "I can reconstruct as if permanent rights were memorialized separately." Jonathan answered, "Proceed. Label as historical agreement." That exchange linked him directly to the document. Bank records showed Altitude's $85,000. Payment entered Prairie Flight's account. Within 1 week, Evan transferred $30,000 to an aviation consulting company owned by Jonathan's wife. Jonathan described the payment as a referral fee for unrelated aircraft market research. No research report existed. Altitude terminated Jonathan. The state referred the false agreement and site control filing to the county prosecutor. Evan agreed to cooperate. Real investigations take time. Nobody was handcuffed at the airpark gate. The criminal questions moved separately from runway construction. My civil case continued toward damages and restoration. Altitude's contractor had removed 22 acres of crops, cut the irrigation main, stripped topsoil, installed drainage, placed crushed stone, and paved nearly 3/4 of a mile. Simply tearing up asphalt wouldn't restore productive farmland. Compacted subsoil could reduce yields for years. Altered drainage could create erosion and standing water. Fragments of asphalt and aggregate had to be removed carefully. I hired an agricultural restoration specialist. His plan required milling the pavement, excavating stone base, removing conduit and lights, rebuilding drainage, replacing topsoil, deep ripping compacted areas, restoring the irrigation line. and monitoring crop yields for 5 seasons. Estimated restoration cost $2. 3 millions. Altitude's first plan budgeted $760. Ling ling ling. It proposed removing pavement, grading the surface, and planting grass. I didn't own a recreation field. I owned productive cropland. Restoration had to return the soil to agricultural use, not make the damage less visible. The court appointed an independent soil expert. She tested compaction, topsoil depth, organic matter, drainage, and residual construction material. Her findings supported most of my specialist's plan. Altitude agreed to fund a $2.5 million restoration bond. The bond would remain active until 3 consecutive crop seasons met specified productivity and drainage targets. The company also offered $1.9 million in civil compensation beyond restoration. Sarah calculated crop loss, trespass, irrigation damage, professional costs, loss of use, and the value Altitude gained by accelerating construction. We countered at $3. 4 millions. Mediation was scheduled. Before it began, the state aviation inspector ordered pavement core testing on Altitude's original 3,400-foot runway. The runway sat entirely on Hawthorne property. It had nothing to do with my ownership, but the company had used the same contractor, accelerated schedule, and quality control firm on both sections. Core samples from 6 locations showed inconsistent asphalt thickness. 2 sections were nearly an inch thinner than the approved design. Density tests fell below specification near the former fuel storage excavation. The runway wasn't about to collapse. It couldn't be certified for the aircraft weights Altitude advertised without correction. The contractor blamed construction interruptions and late design changes. Altitude blamed the contractor. The insurer required repairs before coverage. The state ordered removal and replacement of 100 feet of asphalt surface, reinforcement near the fuel site excavation, and new drainage testing. Correction cost $3. 7 millions. Every part of the runway now needed work. The western extension had to be removed because Altitude didn't own it. The original Hawthorne section had to be rebuilt because it didn't meet design specifications. The northern extension hadn't begun. Hawthorne Airpark had 78 hangar homes, taxiways, and a clubhouse planned around a runway that existed only in brochures. Then the environmental contractor monitoring Dry Creek Basin detected petroleum compounds after a heavy spring rain. Concentrations remained below emergency levels, but exceeded the cleanup target. The contaminated groundwater plume had moved farther than the original model predicted. He had now approached the path of Altitude's proposed eastern drainage outlet. Building that outlet could accelerate movement toward the county channel. Regulators prohibited the eastern extension option until cleanup reached stable limits. The northern route became the only practical permanent runway. Its land purchase with Margaret was secure. Its approach was workable. Its alignment avoided the contamination. But a new survey identified one final issue. The northern threshold sat directly beneath a registered migratory bird flight corridor, used by thousands of sandhill cranes each spring and fall. Bird migration didn't automatically prohibit an airport. It required wildlife risk analysis and operational planning. The state requested a full seasonal study before approving routine operations. That study would take at least 1 migration cycle. Altitude couldn't open the runway that year. The lender extended financing only if the company placed another $8 million into reserves and stopped promising a specific airport opening date. 23 additional buyers requested release. The company now faced a choice: refund them and shrink the project, or offer enough protection that they accepted another year of delay. Thomas and the buyer committee proposed a solution. Every remaining buyer could choose among 3 options: cancel and receive a full deposit refund, remain under contract with money held in escrow until airport registration, or close on the home at a reduced price with no obligation to join the aviation program until the runway opened. Altitude accepted. The project stopped trapping buyers inside one answer. 46 chose to remain. 19 canceled. 13 accepted non-aviation purchases at adjusted prices. Hawthorne Airpark began separating the value of a house from the promise of a runway. That made the development smaller. It also made it more honest. The bird study began that September. Biologists installed cameras, radar equipment, and observation stations along the northern route. Early results showed peak crane movement concentrated during 2 periods each year, primarily in the early morning and evening. Operational limits, habitat management, pilot advisories, and seasonal observation could reduce risk. The problem was manageable. The final report would arrive in spring. For the first time, Altitude appeared to have a legal runway plan. Then Thomas received an email from a former sales manager. Before leaving the company, she had downloaded internal pricing records. The records showed that Altitude charged aviation buyers a runway capital contribution of $125 per home. 48 buyers had already paid or financed that amount through their purchase contracts. Total collected $6 million. The disclosure stated that the money would fund permanent runway construction and reserves. Accounting records showed $2. $4 million went into runway work. Another $1. $1 million paid aviation consultants and permitting. The remaining $2. $5 million had been transferred into Altitude's general development account and used for clubhouse construction, sales commission, and interest on unrelated land loans. The runway contribution wasn't held in a separate trust. The purchase documents might have allowed broad project use. The marketing materials didn't. Buyers believed their $125,000 contributions were building the runway. A quarter of that money had funded a clubhouse pool and expenses from other developments. The state real estate regulator opened a review. The lender froze the remaining buyer contribution funds. Altitude's runway financing problem wasn't only construction anymore. The company had to explain whether money collected for aviation infrastructure had been spent for the purpose buyers were promised, and according to the sales manager's final spreadsheet, Jonathan had authorized every transfer. The state regulator didn't immediately accuse Altitude of stealing buyer deposits. The purchase contracts mattered. Each aviation buyer paid a $125,000 runway capital contribution. Marketing materials described that money as funding, runway construction, lighting, taxiways, navigation planning, and long-term reserves. The legal documents used broader language. They allowed Altitude to apply contributions toward aviation-related development costs and supporting community infrastructure. Altitude argued that the clubhouse, sales expenses, and loan interest supported the airpark as a whole. The buyers argued that nobody would interpret a swimming pool or commission on a non-aviation home as runway infrastructure. Both arguments depended on exact documents, accounting, and what sales representatives told individual buyers. The regulator reviewed contracts, brochure, bank records, invoices, sales emails, training materials, and recorded presentations. It found that Altitude commingled runway contributions with general development funds. Commingling wasn't automatically illegal under those contracts. The larger issue was disclosure. Sales representatives had been trained to tell buyers the $125,000 contribution was protected for permanent aviation infrastructure. It wasn't protected. It wasn't held in escrow. It wasn't restricted to the runway. And Altitude's executives knew part of it was covering unrelated project expenses. The regulator ordered Altitude to provide a complete accounting to every aviation buyer. The company had to replenish $5 million into a restricted runway account before collecting another capital contribution. No future contribution could be used for sales commissions, unrelated debt, clubhouse amenities, or non-aviation projects. Altitude also paid a $340,000 civil penalty and agreed to independent financial monitoring until airport transfer. The company didn't admit criminal fraud. It accepted responsibility for inadequate disclosure and improper accounting controls. The lender imposed an even stricter condition. Every dollar for the new northern runway would pass through a construction control account. Funds would be released only after an independent engineer verified completed work. Altitude could no longer move money between runway, housing, and affiliated projects without written approval. That condition saved Hawthorne Airpark. It also removed the financial flexibility Altitude had used to hide mistakes. The bird study continued through spring. Biologists documented peak sandhill crane movement during 6 weeks in autumn and 5 weeks in spring. Most flocks traveled above the proposed northern runway between sunrise and 9:00 a.m. and again near sunset. The birds didn't make airport operation impossible. They required active risk management. The final wildlife plan included seasonal observation, temporary departure delays during major flock movement, habitat controls near the runway, pilot advisories, and coordination with regional migration monitoring programs. The airport couldn't use noise devices or harmful wildlife controls without separate approval. Pilots would receive clear instructions that migration activity could temporarily close the runway. Some buyers disliked that limitation. Thomas Reed considered it reasonable. "I'd rather wait 20 minutes on the ground," he said, "than meet 500 cranes in the air." The state approved the wildlife plan. The federal government completed release of the obsolete 1,956 aviation corridor after confirming no continuing military need. The release didn't grant Altitude a runway. It removed the federal burden from land Altitude already owned. That allowed the company to redesign 11 cabin lots, the clubhouse parking area, and taxiways without an unresolved government claim. The corridor's historic route remained marked in the county archive. Future owners would know it once existed. Altitude recorded its purchase from Margaret Ellis before grading began. The document included the runway, safety zones, approach protections, drainage, lighting, maintenance access, and agricultural crossing beneath the taxiway bridge. Every right had a legal description. Every use had boundaries. The company finally did with Margaret what it should have done with me. It negotiated before construction. The northern runway required nearly a year of earthwork. Crews graded the center line, constructed drainage, installed a stabilized base, and paved in controlled sections. The contractor that failed the original runway specifications was replaced. An independent laboratory tested asphalt temperature, thickness, density, compaction, and aggregate composition throughout construction. Inspectors didn't wait until the pavement was finished to discover problems. The runway measured 650 feet. It was 50 feet wide, with graded safety areas, LED edge lights, clear markings, wind indicators, and a parallel taxiway connecting the hangar homes. The taxiway bridge allowed Margaret's cattle and equipment to pass beneath without entering aviation areas. Altitude also rebuilt the original 3,400-foot section. The thin asphalt was removed. Weak base near the fuel cleanup area was excavated. Drainage was improved. New pavement met the revised design. The former fuel station moved several hundred feet from the contaminated area. It used above-ground double-walled tanks, leak monitoring, emergency shutoffs, controlled drainage, and an independently licensed operator. The old underground tanks were gone. Groundwater treatment continued beneath the former site. Monitoring showed petroleum concentrations declining. Dry Creek Basin remained protected from construction until regulators confirmed the plume had stabilized. Altitude abandoned the eastern runway extension option permanently. The company recorded that area as a drainage and environmental management parcel controlled by the HOA under a funded maintenance plan. No house, hangar, fuel tank, or paved runway could be built above the plume without agency approval. The northern runway passed its pavement and lighting inspections. State officials conducted an operational review. Emergency responders tested gate access and aircraft incident procedures. Pilots performed calibration flights without passengers. Wildlife observers monitored the first operations. The state registered Hawthorne as a private residential airport 2 years and 8 months after the Cirrus landed on my unfinished field. No part of the approved runway crossed my property. The first official landing belonged to Thomas. Altitude invited reporters and homeowners to watch Thomas approach from the south, touched down inside the northern threshold, and stopped well before the far end. He taxied to his hangar home, shut down both engines, and climbed out to applause. I watched a recording later. I had no desire to attend. The moment belonged to the homeowners and pilots who had waited for a runway they could legally use. The airport didn't open exactly as Altitude first advertised. Operations paused during severe crane activity. The runway was 150 feet shorter. 19 original buyers had canceled. Non-resident memberships required a 2/3 homeowner vote and were limited to 12 during the first 3 years. The fuel facility opened 9 months later than the runway. Those were manageable compromises. The larger correction involved ownership. Hawthorne residents elected a majority of the HOA board before the airport transfer. Thomas became board president. The association hired independent aviation counsel, an airport manager, a reserve specialist, and an insurance advisor. The final infrastructure appraisal excluded every cost connected to the false western route. Legal disputes. Crop damage. Contaminated soil cleanup. Failed pavement. Penalties. And developer corrections. The completed runway. Taxiways. Lights. Fuel facility. Pilot lounge. Security systems and maintenance equipment were valued at $14. 2 millions. The HOA purchase agreement was based on that amount, not the $18. 6 million Altitude originally scheduled. Altitude funded at $2. 4 million initial pavement and equipment reserve. Homeowners adopted annual runway inspections. 5-year pavement reviews. Wildlife reporting. Fuel audits. And emergency exercises. No developer affiliate received an automatic operating contract. The HOA competitively selected a qualified airport management company. Fuel profits flowed into the association's aviation reserve. Non-pilot homeowners paid lower aviation assessments than residents maintaining aircraft access. The payment structure wasn't simple. It was transparent. Every owner knew which part of the dues supported roads, clubhouse facilities, and airport operations. Altitude's cleanup of my farm began before the northern runway opened. The unauthorized asphalt was milled and removed. Crushed stone was excavated in measured sections. Underground lighting conduit came out. Drainage pipes were removed or replaced with agricultural systems designed around the field's original contours. The contractor restored the irrigation main and added isolation valves, so future damage in one section wouldn't shut down 80 acres. Compacted soil required deep ripping in 2 directions. Crews replaced topsoil, corrected organic matter, and removed thousands of small asphalt fragments by mechanical screening and hand collection. The first growing season, I planted sorghum instead of wheat. Sorghum tolerated the disturbed soil better and allowed the restoration specialist to identify drainage problems. 2 low areas held water after spring rain. Altitude repaired them under the bond. The second season, I planted wheat. Yield inside the former runway corridor reached 78% of the surrounding field. The restoration target required at least 90%. The bond remained in place. Additional soil amendments and drainage corrections raised third-year yield to 88%. Still short. Altitude's attorney asked me to accept substantial compliance. I refused. The agreement contained a measurable standard for a reason. The company funded another season of treatment. In the 4th wheat crop, the former runway corridor reached 93% of the control area. Independent agronomists confirmed stable drainage, acceptable compaction, and restored irrigation performance. Only then did I release the final restoration bond. You could still see a faint color difference from the air at ground level. The field looked like farmland again. That was more satisfying than leaving a strip of cracked asphalt as a monument to the lawsuit. My civil mediation occurred during the second restoration year. Altitude offered $2. 4 million beyond the funded agricultural work. Sarah calculated the value of the destroyed crop. Temporary loss of 22 acres. Irrigation damage. Trespass. Unauthorized aviation use. Professional expenses. Soil impairment. And Altitude's deliberate continuation after notice, we settled at $3. 0.5 million. Horizon Civil, the runway contractor, contributed through its insurer. Prairie Flight Holdings contributed a smaller amount and surrendered all historical aviation claims. The settlement required Altitude and Hawthorne HOA to record a permanent release confirming they held no runway, taxiway, approach, lighting, aviation, emergency, access, fuel, utility, or safety zone rights across my farm. The release also prohibited airport maps and marketing from showing my field as a runway extension or protected airport parcel. Pilots could cross above my property at lawful altitude like any other aircraft. They couldn't land, taxi, install equipment, cut crops, or treat the field as emergency airport infrastructure without my permission. The settlement wasn't confidential regarding public records. Regulatory findings, recorded documents, or my experience. I agreed not to disclose individual buyer finances, protected mediation allocations, or private insurance information. That balance protected people who didn't create the dispute without hiding what Altitude had done. Jonathan's case concluded later. Evan Cole admitted creating the false Barrett Aviation Agreement and submitting it to Altitude. He pleaded guilty to one felony count involving a forged instrument and agreed to cooperate. The state didn't treat him as a sophisticated title attorney. It treated him as a consultant who knowingly created a permanent agreement from a signature belonging to a dead landowner. He received 3 years of supervised probation, 250 hours of community service, restitution obligation, and a prohibition on providing title or airport site control services during probation. Investigators traced the $30,000 payment to Jonathan's wife's company. No legitimate aircraft market report existed. Philippe Grant, Altitude's former finance officer, testified that Jonathan approved Prairie Flight's payment, knowing the company had been hired to solve the Western runway rights problem. Jonathan denied instructing Evan to forge anything. The emails about using available Barrett signatures and excluding temporary restrictions became central evidence. He eventually pleaded guilty to submitting a false site control document and misapplying restricted buyer contribution funds. He received 14 months in state custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He paid restitution and was prohibited from managing developer-controlled associations, airport projects, or buyer trust accounts during supervision. Jonathan wasn't imprisoned because he wanted my land. He was punished for the false documents and financial transactions used after I refused to sell. Property pressure remained civil. Forgery and false certifications crossed another line. Altitude terminated 3 additional managers for control failures but didn't accuse them of criminal conduct. The company's board adopted new policies requiring independent land control verification before marketing infrastructure dependent on neighboring property. Buyer capital contributions had to remain inside restricted accounts. Developer-appointed HOA boards couldn't purchase affiliate-owned amenities without outside appraisal and conflict review. Again, those rules arrived late. They still prevented repetition. Altitude's documented costs from the Western Runway decision exceeded $18 million. Agricultural restoration, my settlement, legal fees, regulatory penalties, buyer reimbursements, failed pavement replacement, environmental cleanup, new land acquisition, northern runway construction, consultant correction, and financing delays all added up. That amount didn't include lost home sales, reduced prices, or damaged reputation. The company had originally budgeted $2.5 million to acquire my land and manage negotiation risk. It removed that number and replaced it with $150,000 for historical rights confirmation. The attempt to save roughly $2.35 million cost more than 7 times that amount. And Altitude still paid $4.15 million for Margaret's land. It could have accepted my answer, chosen the northern route, and negotiated honestly before the first buyer signed a contract. Instead, it paved first and treated resistance as a temporary engineering problem. Hawthorne Airpark survived. That mattered. The homeowners weren't the people who cut my irrigation line or copied my father's signature. They were pilots and families who believed the developer's documents. Once they gained control, they operated the airport responsibly. The runway manager called me before the first migration season to explain anticipated flight paths. He didn't need my permission for legal airspace operations. He called because good neighbors communicate before a problem appears. Aircraft sometimes pass north of my house. Most remain high enough that the noise lasts only a few seconds. The runway lights are visible at night as a narrow line beyond the eastern boundary. They don't continue into my field. They end where Altitude's ownership ends. Thomas and I became friends. He landed at the county airport once a year and drove to my farm instead of using Hawthorne's runway. He said the detour prevented anyone from joking that he was testing the old western approach. One autumn afternoon, he helped me repair an irrigation valve near the former center line. He looked across the wheat and asked whether I ever considered keeping a private grass strip. No. You've got enough room. I had enough runway for one lifetime. He laughed. The next spring, the crop completely hid the final surface signs of construction. My father's old crop dusting license remains inside a fireproof cabinet. The document is only 2 pages long. It names Russell Avery. It grants 90 days. It prohibits assignment. It says no permanent easement is created. Altitude spent millions trying to transform those simple terms into something else. The paper never changed. Only the consequences did. Jonathan once told me no court would close a runway and trap millions inside hangars because a farmer wanted to keep planting through an established landing path. He misunderstood the field. It wasn't an established runway. It was farmland where my father once allowed one pilot to land for 1 season. Permission had a name, a purpose, a price, and an ending. Altitude tried to remove the ending. The court put it back. I didn't destroy a $28 million community. I forced its runway onto land the airport legally controlled. I didn't trap aircraft inside hangars. I helped prevent buyers from inheriting an airport built around forged rights and untested pavement. I didn't refuse every solution. I offered temporary access while Altitude redesigned. The company rejected it because its financing required the one thing it hadn't acquired: permanence. The final outcome gave everyone what they were legally entitled to receive. Altitude completed a smaller but functioning development. The buyers gained a registered runway, funded reserves, and transparent records. Margaret received a negotiated price for land she chose to sell. My field returned to production, and the HOA inherited no claim against my farm. That's what made the ending satisfying. Nobody needed to lose everything. The developer only needed to lose the shortcut. If an HOA paved nearly half a mile of runway across your farm and sold 78 fly-in homes before securing the land, would you accept a multi-million-dollar sale? Grant temporary access while it relocated? Or force complete removal from the beginning? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes involving property rights, aviation access, HOA governance, airport development, environmental cleanup, buyer disclosures, and construction financing. Names, characters, companies, and specific locations have been changed. Property, aviation, environmental, contract, and HOA laws vary by jurisdiction. This story is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal or financial advice. Visuals may be generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only.